Do you remember when wargaming was all about rolling some dice and killing your opponent's little dudes? Before all these stratagems and keywords and supplements? Yeah, I remember. And so does one-page rules. Hey everyone, my name is Discourse and welcome to my series where I give you my first impressions of a miniature wargame and ask the question, is it worth your time? This video is not sponsored. It is my honest thoughts and feedback on a system that I have played for a month now. Today I am talking about Grimdark Future by One Page Rules, a game which to me may be the perfect introduction to miniature wargames. Perfect for either new hobbyists or those with teeny tiny attention spans, like me. So for many viewers, I'm sure that Warhammer was probably your first experience with a miniature wargame, like it was mine. And it was good at the time, a huge tome filled with lore and rules and very serious men with very serious beards. To be honest, it was a little bit overwhelming and I was quite lucky actually, because Warhammer had been distilled down to its constituent elements by video games for me. Really, my introduction to Warhammer was in the Dawn of War 1 manual. This is a pretty snappy, concise little primer on what is a sprawling universe. Though you wouldn't know that these days, what with everything of note taking place in Gilliman's living room, and without the little blurbs of each faction in this manual and the beautifully dark voice lines that echoed from the helmets of my Space Marines.
Cleanse, purge, kill!
I could have bounced off Warhammer pretty hard. There was a lot to learn. So many factions, so many words, so many books. In short, it was overwhelming. Not many people like to talk about this, but as a wargame, Warhammer itself is pretty unapproachable. And it's extremely intimidating to get started with, even if you are invested in the IP of that universe. And of course, you have to be ready to spend a lot of money to get into it. It costs what, $115 to find out what your army can even do? Yeah. In contrast, however, Grimdark Future by One Page Rules offers a much different experience. It is a game that asks very little of the player, which is great for me because I don't have a lot to give, honestly. Not a lot going on up there. This is pretty unusual for a mini wargame, which, as we all know, is the most elite of hobbies. Quite so. To play Grimdark Future, you only need to read a couple of pages, which is great if you've destroyed your attention span doom scrolling through Twitter all day. And hey, once you've got that out of the way, you're then free to represent your units on the table with any miniatures that you want. There's no 400-page rulebook, no army supplements, no expensive miniatures to buy here. And that's because, of course, One Page Rules hates lumberjacks. Probably. Why else would they hand players a mere single page? It's a double-sided page though. Really, it is the complete opposite experience from Warhammer. It is a game that concedes that Warhammer is the bigger, nastier, more swaggering, popular game in the marketplace. But nevertheless, it offers an alternative way to play. And by alternative way, I'm not talking about the traditional elements of game design. So things like the turn structure or the pacing, etc. Though it does innovate slightly in some of those areas. Instead, I'm talking about the game at an ideological level. Fundamentally, it reflects a different way of distributing rules to players and provides a different model for how a miniature war game should exist. It's sort of like the Heath Ledger version of Joker to Warhammer's Batman, because Batman is basically Warhammer here. He's rich, he has a book or a tool for every occasion in his utility belt, and he beats you up if you're poor. On the other hand, Joker pretends not to have a plan, but in actuality has a pretty specific ideological position on things and has done loads of planning in the background that you're just not privy to. Yeah, that's a pretty solid analogy there. So the first thing you'll notice about the game, aside from the fact that it's all contained on a single sheet of paper, is that it's all free. You don't have to buy the rulebook, although there is an optional purchase of a larger rulebook that comes with extended deployments and some special rules and things. But the core rules are totally free, including the stats of every single unit in the game. You go on the website, click on a Google Drive link, and then you're presented with everything you need, all the lore and stats of every faction in the game. A far cry from the expansion books and mountain of supplements that you'll need to get started with Warhammer. And And the selection of armies here isn't small. There's 28 in total at the time of recording. And though that could be overwhelming, each one comes with a small blurb describing the general idea and fluff behind each of the factions. It's like they built their own Wahapedia. Imagine that! However, that said, because of the premise of the game is one-page rules, that means that each faction is constrained to a single piece of paper. And this has to work to provide enough space for all of the stats, upgrades, and units in each faction. And that means that army sheets can be really overwhelming at first. You're assaulted by a deluge of names and numbers, of letters taking you to lists in other places on the sheet. There's a lot going on each page here. Once you get used to reading them, it's not that bad, but you should be forewarned that there is a little bit of a barrier to entry here. It might feel a little much at first, especially if you're not used to the paradigms of design for war games. Although, however, it is generally more intuitive than how, say, Warhammer does their equipment lists. Boy, I sure love having to flick through a book trying to find my list of heavy industrial weapons. And if you know anything about Warhammer 40k, you might realize that there's a little bit of familiarity with most of the factions in this game. You have the Battle Brothers, who are very reminiscent of Space Marines, or the Dark Elf Raiders, who are basically the younger siblings to the Drukhari, and the Robot Legions, who are, well, I mean, they're Necrons. They are Necrons. But then again, it's not like Games Workshop weren't heavily inspired when creating these things in the first place. And clearly, these factions are designed to be playable with Games Workshop miniatures. Many of the factions contain rules for units that are clearly designed to reflect the types of capabilities that the equivalent Warhammer 40k unit can do. And there are also other factions from other games here too, like the Rebel Guerrillas, who are clearly designed around the Rebel Alliance from Star Wars Legion, and not like, say, I don't know, Khmer Rouge. This is clever on one-page rules part, but it's pretty derivative. While I appreciated being able to translate my existing Warhammer collection over to Grimdark Future, I could see some of the game design here straining to accommodate their Games Workshop counterparts. Though more recent additions to the game, such as the Eternal Dynasty, have strayed further from the original design space occupied by Warhammer 40k. And this is definitely where the future of the game should lie, in my opinion. It just makes the system a more interesting one when the designers are free to create what they want. But just be warned, this is not the game for you if all you care about is setting and lore. The lore in this game basically amounts to a couple of paragraphs, and the art design is basic and sparse. There's no 55 novel series here about how the Space King killed his space son and now they're all running around the galaxy trying to fight, you know, robots or whatever. I don't know, I kind of flunked Horus Heresy school. I'm afraid I've got a life. 2 of them, in fact. But hey, it's free. It's a free game. So then, the question is, if one-page rules aren't selling the rules of the game, what are they selling? Well, it's options, mostly. The business model is based on the Patreon model. Not a bad model, if I say so myself. I rely on a similar thing as well. Go to patreon.com/discourse miniatures to find out more. And chilling aside, I think that the Patreon model is very consumer friendly. Basically, you can choose to give the designers money, which is brilliant. Check it out, it's an actual innovative business model. Warhammer Seasons. So this is much better than the traditional subscriber model where the moment you cancel your subscription, you lose everything. Instead, you can simply pay £4 to the designers and you get access to everything permanently. But aside from that, they also sell digital STL files for their miniatures. These are digital files of miniatures that you can simply print at home if you have a 3D printer. Here's one I made earlier. We really are living in a sci-fi future, aren't we? A grimdark one, if you will. No, seriously, we seem to have entered a cyberpunk hellscape and just nobody seems to care. Now, not every faction has official models yet, but they are coming out on a monthly basis. The models themselves are good, and I've printed out a few armies of them myself. They're less detailed and busy than their Games Workshop counterparts, I would say, as a general rule. But that makes them easier to paint, in my opinion, and better as game pieces. Most other sculptors seem to be afraid of negative space. That's not the case with the one-page rules miniatures. And in my experience, you can crack out a an army of these in a very short period of time. I did a video in December where I painted an entire 2,000 point army of Battle Sisters in a single night, so it wasn't bad at all. I mean, it was a hellish experience. I wouldn't wish it on my enemies, but you know, it can be done is my point. Maybe give it a couple of days though, rather than a single night. But however, not everyone has access to a 3D printer. Not everyone has seized the means of production. So what do? You who are still bound by the chains of capital? Well, there's a couple of things. So firstly, you can get standees for this game if you're interested in playing just with tokens, which is actually a really accessible way to get into the game without committing to a large purchase of miniatures. But as mentioned earlier, many of the factions in this game have analogs in other game systems. So miniature ranges from Games Workshop, from Mantic Games, from Atomic Mass Games are all suitable to play. Really, any system is, so long as you and your opponent are agreed on what is what. And of course that they are at the 25 to 32mm scale. Look, the game itself is pretty miniatures agnostic, and it's not like one-page rules is collaborating with the ITC in order to enforce their draconian and fussy rules on what little toys are official enough to play with in tournaments. Can you imagine if somebody did that? Puh. Anyone that has an existing collection of miniatures should really have no issues building an army in this system. And really, that is the appeal of the game to many and makes it super accessible for most wargamers, including new ones. As for the gameplay itself, well, it's pretty fast and loose, just like me. Players take turns alternating their activation. So for example, I'll activate one of my specific units, and then you'll activate one of your units, and then I'll activate one of mine, and so on and so forth until all of our units in each army have been activated. And that will be the end of the round. Yes, you heard me correctly. This is not one of those games where each player activates their entire army one after the other. This means that the winner of the game is not determined by the who goes first roll. You will not be reading Love Can Bloom fanfiction and waiting half an hour for your opponent's turn to be over, only to discover as you look up from your phone that your entire force has been decimated and there is no way that you can win. But still, you begrudgingly play the rest of the game because there is no way in hell that you transported 100 miniatures all the way to Ballytarmac in the freezing cold just to give up in the first turn. Whew. That was close, almost lost my cool there. So no, the game is much better paced than that. Instead, you choose a squad of miniatures that have not activated this round, and then you decide, what am I gonna do with them? Units can move and shoot, or they can double move, or they can charge, which is basically a double move, but you get to punch somebody at the end. Every time. Gets me every time. And if a unit attacks another unit either by range or melee, all they need to do then is roll a number of dice equal to what their sheet tells them to, desperately hoping that they will roll above their quality stat. And huzzah! If they do, every roll that got above that quality number is a success. And then the opponent rolls a defensive die for each individual model that was struck by the attack. And a failure to roll above the defense stat is a wound. And most models can only take a single wound before they die, much like me. Or Chaos Space Marines. The chumps. And then it's your opponent's activation, a chance for them to swing right back at you. If you've played any wargame ever at all, your options in Grimdark Future are pretty simple. There's nothing revelatory going on here in terms of what you can do. But the innovation here is not in creating new types of interactions, but in streamlining the process by which interactions take place. Models have two basic stats, quality and defense. That's it. I have described basically everything you need to know in order to play a game of Grimdark Future. That's amazing. It's brilliant. It's so accessible. Grimdark Future is the perfect game for new players, and it is a very easy game to teach. It completely evokes the mood and atmosphere that I would have wanted when I was first getting into the mini wargaming hobby. All I wanted to do was roll some dice and see what happened. It captures that childish whimsy in its mechanics, and they are light and fluffy and not very daunting at all. And I'll be honest, my brain is not quite what it used to be. Sometimes it's really nice not having to remember 40,000 different edge cases when playing a game. Grimdark Future is reminiscent of the earlier, simpler versions of Warhammer 40k. Now that's not to say that the game is simply about murder. Much like real life, it seems like most of your problems can simply be resolved by judicious use of murder. And to some extent, the game is about the art of trading, but instead of exchanging wine for bread, instead you're trading blow for blow. I kill your squad, you kill mine. Many units in this game feel like glass cannons, like they can dish out a punch but not take it very well. Even the hardiest of units felt like they would crumple when focused on. And games sometimes can feel like an endless death spiral as we simply exchange blows across the table, both sides being wiped out in an endless spiral of death. The Verdun strategy. Each game boiling down to allocating the optimal number of wounds to the enemy models. But just like in real life, you quickly learn that murder has complications. Because there are objectives in this game, objectives that you need. Each player takes 5 objective markers and scatters them across the entire game board like so many errant MI5 briefcases. They don't get lost on trains anymore. Did MI5 just stop taking the train? Anyway, so during the game you can capture these objective markers by moving one of your units within 3 inches of them. Then after 4 rounds, whoever has the most markers in their control wins the game. So it's not purely about who can kill who. It's not a death match. And this may surprise you, but I really enjoy killing things. It stems from my deep abiding need to ruin the fun of others. And I have lost games where I focused purely on the performance of murder. Trying to simply kill my opponent has left my forces exhausted, and they have been able to move in and steal the objectives from right under my nose. Clearly, they did not fight with honor, and this is good. The strategy comes less from the interaction of special rules and more with how you use your units on the table. Where do you position your units? What enemies do you attack? When do you go after the objectives and leave your cover? Questions like that. The fun of the game is about the interactions on the table, not with what stratagems you can pull out of your rulebook. However, each faction does come with a theme and a focus. So for example, the Battle Sisters, they get bonuses if they're firing at things within 12 inches. This encourages them to be a pretty aggressive force that wants to shoot and play a little bit of footsie with their opponent. But nevertheless, that's not the focus. The game is blessed and cursed with a design philosophy of simplicity. And that's one-page rules, Grimdark Future, a small slice of wargaming goodness. But it does lose something for being so streamlined. Warhammer is notoriously a bloated, unwieldy mess. There are over 4,600 things to balance according to Arbiter In, and they all come jumbled together, regularly rolled out as part of your pay-to-play appointment with Games Workshop every quarter. Your quarterly tithe, please? However, this does mean that Warhammer gets a lot of content. And while a lot of it contributes to bloat, some of it is, dare I say, pretty good and interesting and adds new things to the game that are exciting. As someone who plays Warhammer, I know both the twin nightmare of receiving too much support for my chosen faction and receiving too little support for my chosen faction. Just Imperial Guard Codex, Beasts of Chaos, come on guys, when? But I'm glad that I don't have 60, 600, 3,000 pages of Space Marine stuff. I'm happy about that. So this is a balancing act, and Games Workshop certainly does not get it. But I'm not sure that one-page rules does either. I'm a little concerned that it errs too close to the side of caution. The game is 2 pages of rules. It's very quick to consume, and then there isn't a lot left to devour afterwards. Where Warhammer 40k would be a veritable feast for a hobbit, Grimdark Future would barely feed an elf. And it can't really do anything differently because its goal, its ideological purpose, is to be a game that is contained within 1 page, even if double-sided. And it can't really do anything else because its goal, its ideological purpose, is to be different from Warhammer. To stand within the marketplace and say, I am different. And that is the strongest aspect of the game. That it provides an opportunity for Warhammer 40k players to realize that yes, actually, things can be a little bit different. We don't need mountains of books. We can have fun with a single page and our imagination. But nevertheless, in practice, I do love to engage in the discourse of Warhammer or games like that. I like sometimes to get lost in a sea of books. Arguing over the table about which build is optimal is part of the joy of miniature wargaming to me. So where Warhammer 40k doesn't execute very well on the idea of depth, it is a miniature wargame with the size of an ocean but the depth of a puddle. One Page Rules has both the size and depth of a puddle. And that sounds mean, but it's not meant to be. Grimdark Future knows what it is. It embraces that. It doesn't claim to be the be-all and end-all of miniature wargames, and it can be part of a wide and varied diet. It does not seek to dominate all your attention, it just simply wants you to have a good time. Warhammer 40k is a profoundly confused game and it lacks focus. It tries to be all things to all people. Grimdark Future, in contrast, is nothing but focused on being an easy to play, easy to learn, light and accessible game. And because of this focus, it is able to be a quick and entertaining miniature game. Something that can be played within an afternoon, easily. And sometimes that's all I want. A quick game where I can set up some miniatures, roll some dice, blast those miniatures off the table, and tell a story told through tactics and chance. Ostensibly, that's what Warhammer 40k pretends to be. Just a game to have some fun with your miniatures. Have a beer and pretzel. But Warhammer has increasingly grown to fail at that task. Grimdark Future succeeds. I give Grimdark Future an arbitrary 7 out of 10 in Discourse's relative rankings. It's a fun, fast game that I have enjoyed most of my time playing over the last month. But I am concerned that there isn't quite enough there for a, excuse my French, a hardcore gamer such as myself to chew on. Though the full Grimdark Future rulebook that you will get access to if you subscribe to the One Page Rules Patreon does offer a lot more modes to play. And it brings in additional deployment options, battlefield objectives, events, all of which add some much needed variance to the core game and can definitely extend how much fun you'll get out of this game, and ultimately help to keep it fresh. And because the army rules are all free, it means that it's very easy to try out different factions, which I had a lot of fun with. There's also a campaign system in the game where units earn XP and can be destroyed permanently, and this is my jam. I like my stories, okay? I just like my stories. Now, I haven't had an opportunity to play the campaign, but it looks pretty solid, if a little simple. It has some random events and rolling on tables for stat increases. What more can you ask? Nothing revolutionary, but again, nice and simple. There's also a mission card system as well, which as a fan of the Batman miniatures game, I'm very interested in trying out, but I haven't had an opportunity yet. So yeah, I would recommend trying it out. There's nothing really to lose. Now, I feel like I've been a little bit harsh in my conclusion here. I have to emphasize again, I had a lot of fun playing this game. I've spent the last month playing this as my primary game, and I have not spent really any money. Unless you count Games Workshop miniatures, in which case I've lost a liver. If all you've played is Warhammer, then honestly, you deserve to check this game out and see if it delivers everything that you need in a miniatures war game. And if you haven't played any war game before, I'd recommend this before Warhammer. You might find that it offers everything you need in a miniature war game at significantly less cost. And if you've never played any game, maybe you're painting miniatures and assembling them right now in order for Warhammer games, I'd really recommend that you play this first. Much of the marketing strategy of other games such as Warhammer 40k is based on the sunk cost fallacy. Grimdark Future dispels that cost. It tells a lie to that strategy. And it also explicitly provides an alternative system. One that I would argue is in many ways superior. This is now the definitive way to get into the miniature wargaming hobby, in my opinion. And that's so impressive for such a relatively new game. So thanks everyone, this video took a long time to make. Maybe next time I'll spend a little bit less time than I did on One Page Rules, but this game is really big right now and I wanted to do it justice. So I hope this was useful, and if it was, please do consider checking out my Patreon at patreon.com/discourseminiatures. You can find out there how to support the channel, and once again, thank you so much to my existing patrons. And there will also be links in the description of this video to everything you need for One Page Rules as well. Also, I want to thank GameMat.eu for providing some terrain that you see in the footage in this video. This means you weren't forced to see all my unpainted plastic terrain. Seriously, I love the pre-painted stuff that they do. Check them out. There is a link to their site in the description of this video. And I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye! Games Workshop delenda est.